Hooray. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to thank DrupalCorn for inviting me, and I would like to thank all of you for your interest in showing up this morning. I have to admit before I get started that, some of you already know this, I decided to rip this talk apart last night and rewrite it. So I appreciate your feedback. This will be a learning moment for me. This is the third time I've done this content, but I decided it would be more effective if I totally changed my narrative arc. So let's give it a go. I appreciate your attention this morning. But anyway, I would like to use your time this morning to share some of my ideas and the inspirations to kind of pique your curiosity and maybe get you to think a little bit differently about how we work. But before I kind of launch into that, I want to talk a little bit about concrete. So humans have been building things for, I don't know, about 8,000 years with concrete. And over all of that time, how you make concrete hasn't fundamentally changed. It's really, really simple, right? You combine some cement as a binder and some sand and other like small stones, and you take water and you kind of, voila, a chemical reaction happens, right? And you get something, and you build something with it. And 90% of any concrete mix is almost always local, and it changes from project to project. And there's rarely any continuity between any two mixtures at any given time. So I'm particularly drawn to figuring out why things last and why other things don't last. So some of you already know this, but I'm kind of a classics dork. And so Roman aqueducts survive. And so there's so many of these aqueducts and these sewers and these piers that survive to this day. And so many of them are as strong or sometimes even stronger today than they were when they were originally created, despite the fact that they've been exposed to water over thousands of years. And yet, we have these like modern bridges that collapse after just a few decades, right? So how is it that Roman concrete ended up being so special? Like, what did we learn, right? What can we learn from this Roman concrete? So why is it that it has this higher durability and higher performance? And especially given the fact that, right, modern concrete, we add all this stuff to it, right? We've got rebar, we have chemical additives, we have all this stuff. We have much more sophisticated technology. So it's baffled, like, the concrete scientists for years and years and years, and they actually think they finally figured it out. Like recently, like in the last 18 months, they think they finally figured this out. And they think they know what's going on. It turns out that the cement they used, the volcanic ash they used as a binder, actually reacted with salt water, which is, by the way, like one of the most corrosive things ever. Usually it's destructor, destroyer of all things, actually to make it stronger. So the more exposure it had to a corrosive element, the stronger Roman concrete got over time. So this is something I find really powerful as a metaphor for me, right? I've run Palantir for almost 22 years now with George Demet, my husband and the founder of Palantir. So for most of that time, I was the president. And I was really involved in kind of day-to-day operations. And 4 years ago, we changed my title. I became CEO. And I think at the time, I don't know how much I understood it or how much I even explained it to the team, but becoming CEO was more than just this kind of title change, right? It was more than just like, equity, like, hey, I do half the work, George, I should be CEO too, It wasn't really like that. It was more like I wanted to transition the operational side, which I love. You can totally get me to talk about numbers anytime you want. Like, I'm really happy to go there with you. But what it did is it allowed me to focus in on how we deliver our mission and our vision and our values. And that change gave me the time and the responsibility to look beyond those day-to-day operations and to think more deeply about the why of Palantir and less about the what and the how. And I've come to see Palantir as cement in the concrete mixture, right? Proportionately, we're just a teeny tiny bit of the whole, but we're essential. And our job as a company is to bind and give strength from project to project, even when the rest of the components all change, always, all the time, right? We bring people together to build something wonderful and something that will last, we hope. And we hope that it gets stronger the more exposure it gets to the real world, right? That's the point, that's the goal. And this, I think if you think about like the workbench work that we did, so Palantir, had this little nugget of an idea. We had several clients who had the same need. We brought them together. None of them could afford to fund it themselves, right? So we brought them all together, and they each funded what they could. We shared their needs, and we put it out in the community. And now, way more than just our clients use Workbench, right? Tons of people use it. It's stronger. We put it out there, and it gets stronger every day. And now it's even in core, right? And I think that is endemic to me of what our values mean and what it means to kind of be that binder, be that catalyst, be that cement. So I think what's important is to understand is that Palantir is all about people. It's about our colleagues, it's about our clients, it's about our community, and it's about those who rely on the solutions that we build. But that's not unique to Palantir. That's the quality of any knowledge organization, any of the companies you work for, any of the organizations you work for. The quality of these organizations always distills down to the team of people who work there. But what we also know is that the average tenure of a person at a company is now less than 4 years across the board, right? And in tech, it's even worse, right? In tech, it's lower. It's around 3 years in the US. So the top tech firms have even more dismal turnover rates. Their average turnover is less than 24 months. So just to break it right down here, right? So what I've just said is that the success of a company, any company, is based around its people who will leave, and their departure is going to be sooner than you think. And I think since that photo I just showed you, which was taken in May, we've had 4 people leave, we've hired 2 people, we have 2 more people coming on board. It just is constant, right? This team change is going to be dynamic, it's going to be continuous, right? And I think that understanding that dynamic team change is the context of a modern work environment, and frees you up as a company and as a team member. You have to embrace that. That is our reality. And so once we do accept that, I think it sets a path to success in a new way. So what's a company to do? You might be thinking to yourself, okay, dude, let's just hire rock stars. That's the plan. And hiring a steady stream of really highly experienced people, right? Steeped in technology or open source, and you get into their GitHub or their D.O account, and you're like, yes, you are the one. Okay, fine. That is definitely a strategy that many have had, right? And as an individual, that's certainly something that many of us, have aspired to. Yes, I'm gonna get my resume in great shape, and someone's gonna pick me up, and I'm gonna get in the best company, and great, and I'm gonna hop from job to job that way. But here's the deal, many go that route, and I'm not gonna lie, we did that too, right? I mean, early on, that's how we built our initial Drupal team. But, I don't think that's the answer, right? A senior-only hiring strategy is problematic for a lot of reasons. And I think that, I do kind of, oops, where did it go? There we go. Where did you go? Now, I love supergroups as much as the next person, but let's be real. We know that most of them don't really last very long. Placing your bets on short-term conditions is not really a great strategic choice for a company, right? If I'm interested in things that last for a really long time, placing your bet on something that's just it's a transient and something that you have no influence on doesn't make any sense, right? And it isn't how you build something sustainable. As I said, I think the senior-only hiring strategy is quite problematic. And it doesn't scale. We know that there aren't enough people, just taking our Drupal world, right? There's not enough people working in Drupal, let alone rock stars to keep up with demand. In fact, we're not even graduating, as a whole industry, we're not graduating enough computer science graduates to meet existing demand, right? So that's not that's not really going to work, right? That will work for just a handful, just a few, but whatever. It's expensive, right? The standard professional services model is actually predicated on a range of experience levels, right? You need to have juniors, you need to have seniors. That's how we differentiate things. You could decide to make a go of it as like a boutique firm, and again, that's a viable model. But most people in the ecosystem can't be boutiques, and you still need to address the talent shortage. You're just kind of ignoring it. You're saying, hey, how do you prepare for the next group of people when those people retire? Or you want to grow your company. You still haven't addressed your pipeline issues. And it also leaves you somewhat vulnerable to downward price pressure, right, as the services invariably commoditize over time. I also think that if you're taking this kind of senior-only hiring strategy, you don't really have a competitive advantage. It's not really about you. It's just all about who you can hire at a moment, right? So again, you as a firm become commoditized, right? You're just there as a vector to get access to certain people. And if those people leave, then what value did you bring? But I think the argument that's most compelling to me, that the thing that matters most to me, is that a senior-only hiring strategy perpetuates inequality. If you're only hiring from the available group of senior experienced people, you are missing out on the opportunity to address the pipeline and retention problem that we already have. And we know that diverse groups of problem solvers outperform high ability homogenous groups. And if you look at all the super groups up here, do you notice something about them? Right? That's just not my bag. I'm interested in making it better, because we know that we are stronger. Tech is stronger when we represent the people we are serving. Our solutions are better when we actually understand and are empathetic with our users. So that's the thing that I'm interested in solving for. So I think that companies, we do have a purpose beyond a logistical function. And I know it's a little regressive of me to say this in the gig economy, but companies add value to their teams and to the work, or we can, right? That's our purpose. And I think that value is encapsulated in organizational culture. So MIT professor Edgar Schein has spent a lifetime studying leadership and organizations, and he defines organizational culture as this pattern of basic assumptions that a given group has kind of invented, discovered, or developed in learning to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that have worked well enough to be considered valid, and that therefore need to be taught to those new members as the correct way to do things, right? So culture is kind of like, hey, this is how we do it, right? So you have a culture, even if you don't work on your culture, even if you don't think about your culture, because there's always a way we do things around here, right? And I think what we need to think about as members of a culture, or those who influence a culture, is that we want to maximize the benefit for both the individual and the organization. So we have to focus the culture on maximizing individual potential. So to do this, an organization's culture must establish this kind of scaffolding for learning and development. And we need to provide this lens through which the memory of this kind of hard-earned past experience is both viewed and understood. So I'm really curious about how we do this, both organizationally at Palantir, but also as a community, right? As a Drupal community and more broadly within tech. As CEO, I've kind of really focused my research and my curiosity on how do we build this company culture where both the organization and those within it continue to learn, to grow, and to adapt over time so that we can be strong. Like concrete, right? That's what I'm looking for. I want Palantir to provide to be that cement, right? I want to produce consistently durable and strong results that stand the test of time. So I think that the key to that is this learning organization, right? And so this is the definition of a learning organization, because I'm going to use this throughout. So I was like, I might put it up on a slide so you can all see it. Right? A learning organization is an organization that's skilled at creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behavior to reflect new knowledge and insights. So right now, learning cultures really do seem to be the exception. As you know, within an organization, we all are learning all the time. We all have these opportunities and we all learn. But what is different about a learning organization is it takes the experiences of the individual, right? We all, through the work that we do, we have an experience, we reflect on that experience, and we come out better, right? But that's individual learning. What's key to a learning organization is they take those individual lessons and elevate it up to the organizational level. So, it's how do you know as a kid, right, that I don't have to actually touch the pan and get burned to know that it's, not a good idea, right? Because the parents, hopefully, try and teach the kid, like, look, no, if we touch this will hurt, right? And you pass it along. And this is the idea behind an organizational culture. So there are a lot of lessons that we're learning every day, from the small to the big. And it's up to those organizations how they actually capture that. So I think that it's very valuable to focus in on this, right? Because learning cultures really are the exception, not the rule. And the status quo works for some, but not all. And it's a problem because we know that, these diverse teams are the way to success, right? This is the way to better serve our clients, and it's quite frankly the way to drive shareholder results. I mean, so beyond those structural and institutional issues, there will always be those who've had fewer opportunities, fewer resources than others, and success in the workplace shouldn't be predetermined by the opportunities, by the advantages, and by the experience you had before you got there. So I think this question is particularly relevant right now because globally we're enduring this transition from an industrial society over to an information society. The rapid changes we've seen over the last 50 years, really driven by IT, driven by the stuff we do every day, has impacted our work, our education, our health, our economy, everything, right? It's just everything is fundamentally different than it had been before. It always astonishes me, right? The fact that I walk around every day with a computer in my pocket that is, more powerful than what it took to put men on the moon. Like, that's pretty cool to me. And, and thanks to the internet, my colleagues aren't sitting next to me. They're around the country, or they could be, around the globe. So I think the impact of all of this change, of all of this technology, this proliferation of information, it's ultimately up to us. What are we going to do differently? How are we going to incorporate this, and how are we going to shape that future? So when we are confronted with something new, we have three choices, right? We can do one of three things, right? We can use this information to affirm, right, what we already know. So in essence, we can take it as confirmation of what we already think we know, and we can keep doing what we've always done, right? So this is social media, right? This is like, hey, I think this, and so I'm going to get a bunch of people to reinforce what I already think. Yay, thanks, Facebook. You could use it to inform you. You could say, okay, let's take these advancements and, let's make incremental improvements, right? And there's nothing wrong with incremental improvements. We could say, let's just iterate on how we're doing things. And I think that's an important part of everyday life, right? And I think before fake news ruined journalism for everyone, this is what good journalism did for us. It basically exposed previously unknown information to us and helped us see where we as a society could do better, right? I think that is very valuable, and that's very important. Or you could take this new opportunity, take this new information, and you could have it transform you, right? And transformation is where you fundamentally rethink what you know, right? And so that is what I'm advocating here today. But before I get into that, I didn't rip out all the Napoleon. This talk used to have a lot more Napoleon. So if you think I have a lot of Napoleon now, just understand there could have been more. So, I think it's important to understand that while there's a lot of technological change, and technological change always presages, transformational change, it takes visionary leadership, right, to push beyond the more incremental improvements, right? Because incremental improvements are very accessible, right? But it really takes visionary leadership to make things easier, right? So transformational leaders see how these technology advancements really open up opportunities to change how we do things. And this is what pushes a society or community past what it had previously thought was possible. So a little bit about 18th century warfare, if you will. So if you want to think about it, it was super waterfall, right? It involved a lot of planning. It involved a lot of execution. It's kind of these very distinct stages, and it was also generally conducted as this attrition warfare, right? And attrition warfare is kind of what it sounds like, super awful. So you had these opposing sides, right? And they would just fight each other until one side lost so many people it could not fight anymore. That's real super if you're one of those people who's on the front lines, right? And it was basically derived, I told you I was a classic stork, right? So attrition means literally to grind down. Like, this sounds super. This is really a great strategy for people because, humans. It is painful and it is grueling, and the losses are staggering. Like, it's so bad. So bad. But what's really interesting to understand about attrition warfare is that the casualties are actually equal on both sides until one side breaks rank. And so it actually has nothing to do with who has more resources or whatever, but it's just basically they're going to just keep fighting until one side, for whatever reason, could be lack of leadership, could be just a weak flank, whatever it is, breaks rank, they'll break it open, and then the casualties will stack up, and then one side will lose the resources. And that's what happens, right? So Napoleon was like, nah, dude, that's not going to work for me. Like, that's not going to work. So what he decided to do was kind of invent Agile. And he wanted to go with a very lean approach, and he decided to go for a decisive victory using the fewest possible resources, which, feels familiar, right? Let's do this as fast as possible, using as little resources as possible. We don't get asked that every day. So what he did is he adapted a strategy that had existed for a while called maneuver warfare, which basically uses shock and disruption to incapacitate the opposing force's decision-making capabilities. Because again, in the traditional way of making war at that time was that you had kind of these commanders who would execute and who did all the thinking, and everyone else did all the executing, and that was it. Like I said, super waterfall, planning, execution, very separate. So his objective was to prioritize speed and mobility, right? And the way that he did that actually involved some really interesting techniques, right? It involved a lot of training and a lot of standardization. So I was super interested to find out that cannonballs weren't a standard size up until Napoleon. Like, it's just whoever made your cannon, got to pick what size ball they made. So you didn't have these standard things. So it was like you would have lots of different ball sizes, and it'd be like, so you couldn't, anyway. So he's like, no, I would really like a standard cannonball size so that regardless of which cannon it goes in, it's going to fire just great. So it was things like that he was like thinking it through. And that allowed the French army's artillery to really be significantly lighter, to be smaller than that of the opposing forces while being just as effective. Because if you don't know what size your cannonball is, you make your cannon really big, right? He's like, no, I want this cannonball, this size cannon, let's go. So this gave them a speed advantage, which allowed them to be much more tactically useful as an artillery for a larger brigade for these kind of larger brigades. And he used these cannons to basically start to punch through, right, in the opposing army's cavalry lines. And then he used his infantry as a column, kind of like a spear, if you think he would break it through. So he would basically use much smaller forces to go through, punch a hole, break it down. He would break their ranks, and then he would totally win, right? So he would go on the offensive when he had no business going on the offensive by traditional means. So he used this kind of rapid experimentation to try new things, learn what worked and what didn't, when and why. And the other cool thing that he did was he developed a playbook. So it wasn't just about Napoleon learning what worked. He made a playbook and then distributed it to his lieutenants. Because he's like, I can't be everywhere, and I don't have the internet, so I need to have a playbook that gives it out to everybody so that they know how I would make this decision, and then they can make good decisions, right? So I'm going to distribute this learning to all my generals, and they're going to be on this thing. So this stupid war lasted decades, destroyed Europe, and basically set up, I don't know, 2 world wars as a result. But other than that, it took so long that this whole thing, this transformation of how war happened, which is a great way to apply your talents, by the way, meant that nobody had the luxury of like being like, stop, I need to figure this out, I'm gonna learn some things, and then I'll come back to you later war. Everybody had to learn while it was happening, right? This is the whole point. Like in our society, in our jobs, we don't get to be like, I'm gonna take some prof dev days and I'm gonna learn some things, right? And we kind of sort of think of it still that way, like I'm gonna go and learn and then I'm gonna come back. No, it doesn't work that way, right? It's actually never worked that way. We all have to learn while we're doing the things that we're doing. And sorry. So anyway, just to summarize, right? This is why Napoleon was successful, right? He had this highly trained and knowledgeable military so that in that playbook, his military could go out and execute all the things he was doing. He had superior collaboration and communication via this playbook. Nobody ever told anybody their secrets. They're like, no, I am special because I know these things, right? No. He was kind of super open source about it. He's like, here's my playbook, guys. Take this, you learn from it, let's be successful together. He had this commitment to learning and iteration. He's like, yeah, that didn't work, let's not do that again. So let's try something else, right? Really rapid experimentation, all of which allowed him to actively manage the battle and opportunistically adjust strategy in real time on the battlefield. So planning and execution had to happen simultaneously because life happens, right? Sounds familiar. So because Napoleon had this first mover advantage and the agility to respond whenever he saw an opportunity, he could deploy his strengths against his opponent's weaknesses, always, right? Because you don't always know when you're going into battle where those weaknesses are going to be. He'd be like, yep, oh, no, I see it, let's go. And then eventually his lieutenants did the same thing. He used this maneuver warfare to leverage his enterprise level thinking, and it was called combined arms approach, that whole artillery thing, combined arms, really cool, look it up. Anyway, and mobile artillery to disrupt the established power dynamics of Europe for a long time. So, impact, influence, legacy, all the things. So he didn't invent any of these things. These technologies were not new, but what he did was he combined them in ways that were truly transformational. He changed his mental representation, we call it like a mental model, how he understands and how he knows what he thinks he knows, to handle the complexity of larger groups of soldiers executing increasingly sophisticated maneuvers. So let me bring it back to Drupal for a minute, right? So I'm gonna give you an analogy, right, for what he did. So as he asked his forces to adapt to this new paradigm of war, it was pretty much as different as taking responsibility for like 2,000 individual websites versus, the paradigm of building and architecting a platform that runs 2,000 websites, right? So, as anybody in the room who's done platform work knows, right, the architecture required to build a single site, right, it's simpler. It's easy to conceptualize. You can train somebody on it. You can build, like, anybody in this room, if you haven't done it, you can totally learn to build a single site in a day today. Someone here will show you how, no big deal, right? And it's faster to set up. You can clone it, you can, learn it, no big deal. But it does take a lot more complex modeling. It takes a lot of communication, it takes a lot of collaboration, it takes more people to be able to plan and execute and iterate on a really well-constructed Drupal platform, right? But that said, in these cases of really big scale, the platform starts to show its advantages, right? It generates these kind of efficiencies because you have the standardization. You need fewer resources to maintain those, 2,000 sites because really you have this platform and you're going to roll it out at once. So when there's a Drupal-geddon, you're like, no, dude, done, 5 minutes, we're all good, And then you've got greater speed of deployment, you've got increased security, lower cost over time, in exchange for this greater initial investment, right? And you have to do a lot of training to be able to accommodate that complexity. Being able to handle really complex situations involves more training, it involves more complexity, and it's harder to do yourself. Like, you can't just be that one person. You actually have to be really collaborative with other people. You have to work really well. So, just as you have to invest in appropriate DevOps to be able to sustain and extend a good platform, you must create and nurture a culture that incentivizes and supports learning. So, interestingly, our educational system was largely shaped, actually, as a result of Napoleon's success on the battlefield. So, reeling from his defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, Frederick William III decided he enhanced the formal education system of Prussia. So he witnessed like how well trained and how educated this French army had been, and so he wanted to emphasize all of those qualities that a good soldier would have. So that's what he built in this Prussian kind of educational system, like technical skills, like reading and writing, because the French army could read and write. That was revolutionary, actually. So anyway, and so what he did is he also built these social skills into the educational system, but they were things like obedience and loyalty and duty and diligence, right? So he built this whole system around, ooh, you will do what you say you do, be a good soldier, go, bye. And as a side note, I would like to say this is what happens when you take a tactic and elevate it to a strategy, bad things, right? So, for Napoleon, standardization and training, that was a tactic that he was using because it was all about his objective for speed and agility. That's what he needed to be able to do that. It wasn't actually his strategy for Frederick and education for a long time. This became their strategy. Good deal. Fun times. So this Prussian educational system came over to the U.S. and the American educational system. And in the U.S., standardization became the strategy that was used to produce obedient students, obedient citizens, right, to work in factories created by the Industrial Revolution. Yay, hooray. So much so that it's actually called the factory model of education. So this type of schooling emphasizes top-down management, separation from community, emphasis on management, centralized planning, standardization, and efficiency in producing results. It works super well for jobs and environments where the tasks are really highly structured or precisely defined in manufacturing. There are places where that is very valuable. But that sector's been on the decline for years, and those jobs are becoming increasingly automated. Many of us, and I would hazard to say most of us in the room here today, right, we're knowledge workers. It's not what we do, right? We handle large degrees of uncertainty. And high performance in that kind of environment requires more than basic skills, more than basic problem solving. So to adapt to our kind of opportunities that we have to focus on solving problems that can't be solved by computers. We have to do the things that, like, I don't know, for job security purposes, we have to do the things that we can't be automated away. Let's not let the robots take our jobs. Let's, do those things, right? So research shows us that autonomy and self-direction is what facilitates the kind of creative problem solving required by these kind of high uncertainty types of tasks. But this is actually where workplaces really struggle. Because only some people really seem to naturally thrive in workplaces that have high degrees of autonomy and self-direction. So the work in the environment and the work itself isn't enough to guarantee success. So the opportunity and the challenge that I see as we adapt our workplaces and our cultures is to really try and maximize it so that as many people as possible can succeed within these autonomous, self-directed environments. And I think that means equipping more people with the tools to be successful in that environment. So not just those who already have the privilege or the circumstance that affords it to them, right? So learning while at work is the key to this, right? So, okay, now that we know we have to learn, how do we do it, right? These observations actually aren't new. People, like the fine folks at IBM in the 70s started to freak out, and they're like, whoa, we don't have enough people who have the skills that we need, let's fix it, right? So actually they saw it coming, and so by the early 80s, it had become clear that the nature of the work and the skills that were needed just weren't being created by the factory system of education. So they studied it, of course, and they made some lists, because they liked lists. And they said, okay, well, we got the basic skills like reading and writing and arithmetic, and what we really want to do is we want to focus on the components of what they call deeper learning, right? So deeper learning is what's going to be necessary and what is necessary to compete in a faster and more interconnected information society. So what you see up here, these are called the 21st century skills, right? And this is the chart created by the National Research Council, which divides all of the 21st century skills into these three areas, right? You've got your cognitive skills, your interpersonal skills, and your intrapersonal skills. The cognitive skills over there, those are the ones that emphasize non-routine problem solving, critical thinking, and systems thinking. Then you've got your interpersonal skills up here, right, which center around complex communication, social skills, teamwork, cultural sensitivity, and dealing with diversity. And then you've got your intrapersonal skills, which are self-management, time management, self-development, self-regulation, adaptability, executive function, all that good stuff. So the reality is that your professional success is dependent on skills that you probably didn't start off with when you started your career. And this establishes your personal incentive for learning, growing, and change, in addition to the organizational one that I've been talking about, right? So the organization has an incentive because, well, that's why we exist. But also, individually, in order for you to be successful, particularly in a knowledge economy, you need to really, particularly in the interpersonal and intrapersonal, you need to keep developing those things. So I think it's this alignment between that personal motivation and the organizational learning objectives that creates that motivation for us to transform our work cultures. So there's a bunch of stuff up here, but I really think that if we want to focus on transforming it, we really distill it down to 6, right? The 6 most important on this list are the content knowledge, right, which actually we all know how to do, right? We do this pretty well. Because schools teach us how to learn content knowledge. In fact, that's the one thing that schools have always done pretty well. Then you've got your critical thinking and your complex problem solving, communication, collaboration, learning how to learn, and growth mindset. So when you think about all of them as a set, it kind of makes sense. In order to be professionally successful in an information society, you need to know how to learn to an expert degree and believe that you can. You need to be interested to learn new skills and information in such a way as to build expertise and to be able to apply them at a systemic level. And you have to be able to work with others, which requires a high degree of collaboration and communication. Is there anyone here who doesn't believe me? Like, this is like totally thinks I'm just totally full of shit. Nobody? Okay, great. Anybody? Okay, good. Phew. Great. So, Carol Dweck is a Stanford professor, and she has spent her career studying why people succeed and how to foster success. And so she's found that the key difference for success relates to a person's underlying beliefs about whether or not abilities change. So this is called the implicit theories of intelligence, right? So in a fixed mindset, people believe that your basic qualities, like their intelligence or their talent, are fixed traits, right? They spend their time documenting their intelligence or their talent instead of developing them, right? It's like, I'm going to prove to you that I'm smart, as opposed to, I'm going to learn something and I'm going to show you what I am learning, right? They also believe that talent alone creates success without effort. Like, I totally didn't study for that test and I got an A on it. Yep, that's a fixed mindset, by the way. In contrast, those with a growth mindset believe that those basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. Brains and talent are just your starting point. So where you end up is all entirely dependent to you, right? None of us control where we started. And that's the good and the bad news of it, right? This view creates a love of learning, and it creates a resilience that leads to great accomplishment. So hard work isn't something that makes you vulnerable, but it is something that makes you smarter. So success or failure is about what you do, not about who you are. So whether you are a basketball fan or not, you probably know who this is. This is Michael Jordan, who played his entire career for the Bulls, and he's generally considered the greatest basketball player of all time. Although I'm from Akron, Ohio, so just gonna leave that right there. Anyway, he has 6 NBA championships and 6 NBA final MVPs and 5 MVP awards, and he was 14-time All-Star. Blah blah blah. Given his resume, you might suspect that he was a natural talent, but I don't know how many of you know this, but he was actually cut from his varsity basketball team his sophomore year in high school for lack of promise. He didn't let that failure become his identity. In fact, it was an action that motivated him to practice harder. Jordan became the best at practice, better than anyone, all the way through his career. He was to the day he retired, first in, last out. And every day he focused on fundamentals. So there's this like famous Nike ad, maybe you've seen it, and it's Jordan narrating over, dramatic black and white imagery. It's like, I've missed more than 9,000 shots. I've lost almost 300 games. I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. And I have failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. So even when Michael Jordan was at the top of his game, he continued to evolve his play over time, making these incremental improvements with his dedicated practice. He understood there was always something to learn, always something to improve. And I think mindset is something that you really need to be aware of because it impacts a person's motivation toward achievement. Be aware of personally for where you're at, but also be aware of where your colleagues are and your team members are. It impacts the type of goals that a person's likely to set, whether they're performance goals or mastery goals, how they're going to respond to challenges, whether a failure is an action due to a non-mastered skill or an identity, which is something that person will never excel. So to create an environment that fosters the potential of all individuals, a company needs to demonstrate a genuine belief in human development, right? You have to create a growth mindset culture, right? And the way you do that is you promote managers who actually understand how to coach people, that they have an openness about giving and receiving feedback and resilience in the face of kind of challenges and how they handle them. With this, and you give them training. You teach them how to be specific, and you give them proper support. You talk about all skills as learnable. So regardless of if somebody is, in one specialty, if they're interested and want to learn something else, yes, you can. This is how you do it, right? You convey that there's an organizational commitment to learning and perseverance, not just to innate genius or talent or where you showed up, right? You hire junior people. You hire people who don't know a thing. You let people do something that they haven't done before. You give feedback in such a way that promotes learning and future success. And you present managers as resources for learning. So, if I've convinced you that you can learn anything, what do we do about it, right? So how do we do it, right? The answer is actually practice, right? So I want to update the adage, practice makes perfect. No. It's actually perfect practice makes perfect. So Malcolm Gladwell, this is the only book I'm going to recommend you don't read. Of the people I'm mentioning, don't waste your time. So he has this book, Outliers, and he coins this term about 10,000 hour rule, right? And he's like, at its core, don't read the book. He says that regardless of what type of pursuit it is, whether it's athletic or musical or professional, that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at something. And he bases his claim on the work of a Swedish psychologist and Florida State University professor, Kate Anders Ericsson, who studies expertise and performance, right? So the only problem is that's bullshit. Like, that's not true, okay? And if you do want to read a book, read Ericsson's book, Peak, instead. So let me give you a story. So, anybody familiar with the pot roast story? So it's a story about a little girl, right? One day she comes home and she notices that her mom is cutting the ends off a pot roast before she puts it in the oven to cook for dinner, right? And so she had seen her mom do this like every time her mom made a pot roast. And so this time she was like, nah, I kind of want to know why. Why are you cutting the ends off the pot roast before you put it in? Her mom's like, oh, I have no idea. I've always done it this way. My mom did it this way. So go ask Grandma, right? So the girl calls up her grandma. It's like, Grandma, why do we cut the ends off the pot roast before we cook it? And Grandma's like, well, I don't know. My mom always did it that way, right? And so ask Nana, right? So then the girl's like, all right, fine. So she goes to the nursing home and asks their Nana, and she's like, Nana, why do we cut the ends off the pot roast? And Nana's like, well, when I was first married, I had a really small oven, and the pot roast didn't fit in unless I cut the ends off, right? So how many of us do things over and over and over, and we don't even think about why, right? So, yeah, they practice that. Did that make them any better, right? Not all practice leads to improvement. And just because you do something doesn't mean it's right? So you have to think about something that you know how to do, right, without even thinking about it, whether it's cooking or like riding a bike or like maybe you were like a high school athlete, like are you as good today as you were then, right? Swimming, football, whatever. So there's a common pattern of practice that Erickson talks about called naive practice, right? Where you keep doing it, right? You have this general practice approach, which we have a general idea of what you want to do. You know the rules, and you reach an acceptable level of performance. Like, I can go play tennis. I can play a game. It's fine, right? But you get to that point where you're like, yep, someone will play with me and we're good, and you keep doing it. Maybe you do it every Saturday with like your best friend. But you've reached this kind of plateau. You're actually not getting any better by those Saturday games, just so you know. Once it happens, additional years of practice, even if you reach or exceed that 10,000 hours, no, it's not going to lead to improvement. In fact, your ability is probably getting worse since it's become automated. And automated abilities actually gradually deteriorate in the absence of any effort to improve. So what the 10,000 hour rule gets wrong is pretty clear. But there is one thing that the 10,000 hour rule does get right, or kind of captures, which is that it takes a tremendous amount of effort over many, many years to become accomplished in a field. But not all practice leads to learning. And learning is what you actually need to improve your performance, right? So organizations also don't automatically get better, right? Just because they've been around a long time. You actually have to work on that too. So there's no point at which performance maxes out, by the way. And so there's no point at which additional practice doesn't lead to further improvement. Just ask Michael Jordan, right? He was in there every day, getting better. The most effective forms of practice are doing more than helping your performance. They're actually increasing your ability to perform. So what distinguishes those who become an expert from everybody else is actually the quality and the quantity of their mental representations. Through years of practice, what happens is experts have developed really complex and sophisticated representations of various situations that they're likely to encounter, right? It's just patterns, right? They do a lot of pattern recognition. And so they see those patterns as things that the rest of us would see as kind of random or disconnected, and they recognize them really, really quickly. This is what a master chess player does. I'm not a master chess player. I can look at it, I understand the pieces, I know how they move, I know how they interact with each other, but I'm like, oh, okay, what should I do next, right? No. Master chess player actually sees the entire board at once, and that's a pattern, and they've got the next pattern, and the next pattern, and the next pattern, and they're stored as one data point, whereas I'm like, oh, look at all the pieces, let me look at them individually. Yeah, no, I will always lose to I will most often lose to a master chess player. Everyone gets lucky sometimes. And I'm watching this happen with my older son. Like he's learning to play chess, and that kid is a pattern guy. And so I'm watching him learn these patterns. He's like, oh, I'm gonna do this thing. Like, I'm in the kitchen. I'm like, what are you talking about, the kitchen? But he sees them as patterns, and so he's learning. I'm watching him learn these amazing mental representations, and I'm like, that's a piece. It can do this. So I think the benefit of having these models is that they help experts understand and interpret information, keep it in their memory, organize it, analyze it, and use it to make decisions extremely quickly, right? They don't have to waste cycles because they see a pattern and it's a single piece, and then they can apply it. So that's all about learning at the individual level, but what does organizational learning even mean, right? So it's the process of detecting and correcting errors, and it means recognizing and seeing these patterns that exist at an interpersonal level, and that failure at that level is rarely, if ever, the result of any one person or any one thing. Failure organizationally, or errors organizationally, they're systemic, and you have to be committed to getting to that root cause. So there's a model for this, and this is the model called double loop learning. So most learning is about problem solving, and so it's a single loop. And so this is this loop over here, right? And it's all about how. So what happens is you're like, oh, hey, something went wrong, didn't like that result. Let's incorporate it. How can we make our work more efficient? We're going to look at our techniques and tools, and then we're going to go back and we're going to do it again, right? We're just going to be that little single loop, right? And even that gets disrupted for people, right? When you disrupt your single loop learning, you're like, no, it was this person's fault, right? And that single loop learning gets disrupted because, quite honestly, in our modern context, smart people aren't used to being wrong. It doesn't happen very often for them sometimes. And so they're like defensive and they're like, I'm gonna blame you, right? So this is where organizations have to get involved and be like, no, we're gonna learn from this. And this is a normal thing and this is what happens. So some organizations really even need to focus on just establishing single loop learning environments where, hey, it's okay to make a mistake. But this is where I think we gain an advantage by working in Drupal and by working in open source. Because of the way that we do contribution out in the open and we have pull requests, we actually are fairly comfortable with single loop learning. We make mistakes all the time, other people catch them, and then we get corrected, and it's fine. We move on most of the time. Most people are pretty decent human beings about such things, and that works pretty well. So, but what you want to do at an organizational level is you want to incorporate double loop learning, where like with the pot roast, eventually you ask why, right? You know, you're like, oh, dude, should I be cutting the ends off that pot roast? That looked like good meat, right? You're like, oh, I'm gonna make sure that the reason we're using the technique we're using is the right one, right? So this is a double loop learning environment where you actually reflect and make sure that the underlying assumptions that you're basing it on still apply, right? And this happens every once in a while. Even in Drupal, right? You know, are we right to be using the things that we're using? Are we right to be writing this ourselves? Is there a library we could be using for this? Should we pull something else in? Should we have more rapid release cycles? Should they be, I don't know, regular? So sometimes we question those basic assumptions, and this is really important to be able to come back here and to do this. So that's called double loop learning. So purposeful practice, right, has very well-defined, very specific goals, and it's put together a realistic plan for incremental improvement, right? It's focused, it depends on feedback, and it requires challenge. You have to get out of your comfort zone. So if you do want to get better at something, if you want to innovate, if you want to move forward both personally or as an organization, you really do have to, you know, you have to try hard. You have to try smarter, not harder, right? You got to be Scrooge McDuck. So I think that when we look at this in the organizational context, the purposeful practice is all about the experimentation that drives this innovation, right? And when we think about this, I turned to this researcher, Amy Edmondson, who studies teams and what makes them successful or not. And so she's created a model for what learning actually looks like in teams. And so she created this model, right? And it basically says this. It says that your team structure leads to team beliefs, which then leads to team behaviors, which determines your outcomes. Okay, fine. Let's talk about that. So what she noticed in studying these teams is that if the leader of the team, if your team leader is supportive, coaching-oriented, and has a non-defensive response to questions and challenges, the members of the team are likely to conclude that the team constitutes a safe environment. In contrast, if the team leader acts in an authoritarian way or punitive ways, team members are going to be reluctant to engage in interpersonal risk, and that's necessary to involve learning behaviors. So they're not going to discuss errors. They're going to be like, oh, I think we're making a mistake, but I'm going to keep that to myself, right? And this is a big problem. Furthermore, team leaders themselves can engage in those learning behaviors, modeling it for others, and then influencing the culture, right? So they can demonstrate the appropriateness, or lack thereof, of punishment for risks. So effective team leader coaching and access to the kinds of context supports, which are access to information or research, create these kind of preconditions necessary. So if you don't have effective leaders who know how to create that conditions for these team beliefs, which I'm going to spoiler alert, it's called psychological safety. If your leadership can't create psychological safety, you're really not going to experience good results, no matter how great your individual team members are in a cross-functional team. So what she noticed is that, again, regardless of the composition of the team, that all of these teams that had successful outcomes had very consistent beliefs, and those beliefs included the members of the team respected each other. The members of the team were interested in each other as human beings. If you were on a high-performing team, you weren't rejected for being yourself or stating what you think. And members of the team believe that other members of the team have positive intent, right? So psychological safety is the shared belief about the consequence of interpersonal risk-taking. I'm not talking about trust here. So trust is like, I think that you're going to do something that is in my interest, right? You're not going to act against me. I trust you at a personal level, right? Team psychological safety goes beyond that kind of interpersonal trust, right? It describes a team climate that's characterized by trust in this kind of mutual respect in which people are really comfortable being themselves. For team psychological safety to be this kind of group level construct, it has to characterize the entire team rather than individual members of the team. And the individual team members also must have similar perceptions of it. So the beliefs of the team have to be characteristic of the entire group for the group to be psychologically safe. And when you have psychological safety in your group, you actually see a similar pattern of behaviors start to emerge, right? And these are not things you can direct. These are things that come, again, from investing in the kind of team structures and team supports you put in place. So the team behaviors you start to see when you're in this learning environment, that promote learning, essentially, are seeking and giving feedback. You see them making changes and improvements as opposed to kind of going down the wrong path too long, right? They obtain or provide help or expertise. They're experimenting. They're engaging in constructive conflict, right? This isn't about groupthink. This is about, okay, I'm bringing an idea to the table, and how do we discuss something when we disagree in a constructive way? Can we pull it back to research? Can we pull back to basics? And I think this is really interesting because we've seen this in Drupal. Like the initiatives that were very successful for Drupal 8, I want to talk about Gabor. This is how Gabor leads. This is how Gabor creates psychological safety on his teams, and he promotes learning within those teams. But I also think that, so there's a researcher who's now at Baylor, who studied Drupal. He did a big survey of all the Drupal companies, actually. And he found, of his results, he wanted to understand the value of contribution to businesses. And interestingly, in his research, his name's Jonathan Sims, in his research, what he found was that the firms that both give and receive help actually experienced the biggest innovation and economic gains from participation in Drupal, right? And I think it actually comes down to this, because what we were teaching them, what those companies earned, what those companies learned, was how to give and create the constructive learning loops, right? Giving and seeking feedback and making those incremental changes, that all worked. So I think that once you've done that, once you've created that sense of psychological safety, and then you've created those positive team behaviors, then you actually can start to have innovation. The last piece is all about creating the expert, right? And to become an expert, Erickson says, really relies on deliberate practice. And so this comes down to the individual, but I do think there's an organizational piece to it as well. So the most effective way to become an expert is similar to purposeful practice, but instead of being self-directed, it requires a teacher or a coach. You cannot do deliberate practice on your own. You actually have to have somebody who's well developed in the field, who understands it, and where that practice is informed by the performance and techniques of those who've come before. So if you are innovating in a field, you are doing purposeful practice, right? If you are trying to master something that's established and become an expert in it, you're doing deliberate practice, right? So this deliberate practice develops skills with other people who've already figured out how to do it. This is why, Dick Button, I'm going to use a figure skating analogy. Does it mean anything to anyone in the room? Sweet, thanks. All right. So Dick Button is like one of the greatest figure skaters of all time. You might have seen him. He commentates. He's amazing, right? But he invented how to do certain jumps that 12-year-olds do now every day, right? But he is still considered to be one of the greatest figure skaters of all time because he had to figure out how to do it the first time. It's really, really hard to invent something new, right? But once it's been invented, once that knowledge is out there, then others can coach and learn around it. So that's why 12-year-olds can do something that the greatest skaters of all time took them their entire careers to learn how to do, because they were inventing it, right? This is the value of deliberate practice. You can become an expert much, much more quickly than you can become an innovator, right? You kind of have to be an expert and then become an innovator, right? And that's why when you're at that innovator level, that mentorship is actually really important. This is why having junior members of your team is really important if you're a senior practitioner. Once you become an expert, you need to flip it and become a teacher, right? Those who can teach. So I think you're using well-defined, very specific goals. You know how your coach is there to essentially understand exactly what the next step is, and they're always pushing you exactly what the next step is. That's how deliberate practice helps you become an expert. So organizationally and more broadly in tech, creating these structures for deliberate practice is how we're going to expand our pipeline. This is how we're going to ensure what our industry looks like for the next 20 years. And I think this is through mentorship, it's through paid internships, it's through apprenticeship programs, and this is how we're going to make it better. So anybody can improve. It just takes the right approach, the right support, and it takes learning while real work gets done, so that you and those around you can get into the habit of practicing and thinking about practicing. And so this is how we're going to unlock our own potential and the potential of those around us. So companies and organizations can provide the infrastructure to support this type of learning by building a growth mindset culture. And we do this by hiring, by training, by promoting managers who are passionate about coaching and learning, who have an openness to giving and receiving feedback, and a resilience in the face of challenges and supporting them with training and specifics of effective communication and mentoring. I think we have the opportunity now to shift the nature of work, to increase access to participation in the work we do, to incorporate the skills and talents of more people than we ever have before, and bring about this transformation. I think this gives each of us more agency and more control over our success than we've ever had before. So my hope is that what I've shared with you has piqued your own curiosity about this. I hope you're curious about where learning fits into your own career development and your own organization, curious about how you and your own work in your organization and in your community can change your habits, change your assumptions about those around you, so that you can drive and improve not just your own success, but the success of everybody who works with you. So with that, I leave you with the words of former U.S. Secretary of Education, John Gardner, and just, what are you going to learn next? And how are you going to help others learn? So, thank you.
One or two questions?
Yeah, any questions? Fire hose. Anyone need a nap? Yeah.
I didn't catch the name of the book that you did recommend, Erickson.
It's called Peak. Kay Anders Erickson, and the book is called Peak. And then Carol Dweck's book is called Mindset. But yeah, there's one of the suggestions I got, too late to add it in here, but I can send it out. I can add it when I upload the slides. Is a reading list of all the books. And Amy Edmondson has a new book coming out, I think later this month. It's not October yet, but in October, she has a new book coming out, which is I will recommend as well. Pretty sure. So. All right, thank you.